I'm Shonn Faircloth. I'm the Director of Strategy and Policy with the Richard Dawkins Foundation. And we did notice coming from the foundation from Washington, D.C., that you seem to have a lot of churches here in South Carolina. But I want you to know that we have some houses of worship in Washington, D.C. as well. Welcome, everybody. Climb on up. Some of you may be familiar with some of our houses of worship. For instance, some of you might know the name of Mark Sanford, who participated in C Street. Have a seat over here. Yeah, C Street was alleged to be a house of worship. Really, it was a rooming house for politicians who got low-cost housings who claimed that they were very, very religious. But then it became more notoriously known because they got a tax deduction for having religious services at this so-called church. But then it became known as the Prayboy Mansion. Because Mark Sanford and others, they were enjoying services all right, and they may have even shouted, "Oh God," but these were not the type of services for which you normally get a tax deduction. So I encourage all of you tonight, in honor of Mark Sanford, by the way, to get some cardiovascular health and get out tonight and hike the Appalachian Trail in his honor. You know, there really is no state like your state. As a 10-year politician, I have to tell you that in the pantheon of politicians, there are no politicians like South Carolina politicians. Yeah. Cast your mind back a little ways to Lee Atwater, who expressly joined evangelicalism with right-wing politics. John Calhoun, who considered himself a religious man and was the leading proponent of slavery in the United States in the 1800s. Congressman Preston Brooks, for some of you who have your memory of history, who considered himself a devout Christian and who nearly beat to death an abolitionist senator with a cane on the floor of the United States Senate. Strom Thurmond, the man who bolted the Democratic Party, adamantly opposing the mixing of the races. Some of you may recall the irony in that one. And Jim DeMint, I'm not making this up, Jim DeMint, who said that women should not be able to communicate with their doctors over the internet about their reproductive choices. As to paraphrase Joe Wilson, no lie. And culminating with Tim Scott, who said, and I quote him, "The greatest minority under assault today are Christians." He said this while, of course, opposing women's rights and equality for gay people, and he said, and I'm quoting, "You can look no further than the Word of God for a moral compass." And in fact, you can look there. In 1850, in this city, a prominent clergyman, a theologian, James Thornwell, declared, and I quote, that those who sought to abolish slavery were, quote, atheists and socialists. And that in contrast, yes. And that in contrast, slaveholders were, and I quote, the friend of order and regulated freedom. And he concluded, quoting, "The world is the battleground. Christianity and atheism, the combatants and the progress of humanity is at stake." Well, I couldn't agree with that last statement more. But the future, that was the past. You, in this room, are the future. People like Amy Monsky, the president of the Secular Humanists of Low Country. Where's Amy? Where's Amy? Give her a round of applause. Now, Amy and all of you are willing to take on a challenge, and I think you are doing a fantastic job, and we want to thank the Secular Humanists of Low Country for sponsoring this talk tonight. We also want to thank the College of Charleston. The hosting includes the biology department, the philosophy department, the religious studies department, and the secular student groups. A big round of applause to all of them. Now I want to turn my attention to South Carolina's own Herb Silverman. Herb Silverman is Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the College of Charleston, recipient of the Distinguished Research Award, founder and President Emeritus of the Secular Coalition for America, founder of the Secular Humanists of the Low Country. You should read his blog at the Washington Post on faith, where he regularly comments on issues, and Herb has appeared in numerous debates throughout the entire world, including one at the Oxford Union in Oxford, England. His book, which is entitled Candidate Without a Prayer, an autobiography of a Jewish atheist in the Bible Belt, is a book I highly recommend. And he has long been closely associated with Richard Dawkins. Now, Richard Dawkins, and I checked with another scientist to make sure I had this right, and they said I could say this, Richard Dawkins is the most cited scientist alive. As many of you know, because I see you holding them, he is the author of many best-selling books, including his upcoming autobiography due this fall, Childhood, Boyhood, Truth. Now, you might think the most cited scientist alive, many best-selling books, but he goes even further instead of resting on his laurels. And I have to say that I have been humbled to be direct witness to this as opening speaker for 3 of his book tours. I have seen time and again people come up to Richard Dawkins and say, "You have changed my life." Over and over, I hear people say this. And so I have to say that of the names of men born before 1945 who have such huge appeal to people born after 1975, those names are apparently Dylan, McCartney, Jagger, and Dawkins. And this is where the lives of these 2 very important men in history intertwine. Herb Silverman, South Carolina's Herb Silverman, had a great vision for uniting secular groups to a common cause. And Herb and I are passionate and share this desire to organize with all of you to have secularism have a greater influence in society. And Richard Dawkins is the astoundingly effective voice and catalyst to a huge and growing social movement, a cause to which I will devote my life, and I'm hoping that each and every one of you in this room will devote a part of your life to the cause of freeing the world of dogma, freeing the world of the harm that springs from fundamentalism, which is a prominent part of the mission of the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science. Let's all work together, and without further ado, Herb Silverman and Richard Dawkins. Thank you.
Well, Herb, is this microphone on? No.
Does this work? Mine is on.
Hello? Yeah. Herb, I know you never wear T-shirts, and so I thought I'd try to reform you by presenting you with this new product of our website. Religion, together we can find the cure. So, let's hang it up here.
Thank you very much, Richard. You've converted me into wearing T-shirts from now on. You know, I'm not used to walking out on the stage and getting a standing ovation, and I really enjoy it, even though I know it's not for me. But, you know, Richard, I'd like to start by saying, as a distinguished evolutionary biologist, you did 2 things that very few academics or scientists ever even attempt. First, you wrote expository books like The Selfish Gene to explain science to non-scientists. But then you also became the most famous atheist in the known universe. Now, was it your interest in promoting science to the general public that motivated you to engage with religion?
I love truth. And I think that the truth about the world, the truth about the universe is utterly exciting. It's enthralling, it's exhilarating, and it knocks into a cocked hat the sort of parochial, petty, medieval, pre-medieval, dark age view of the world, which is the religious view. And therefore, going against religion is for me an integral part of being an expository writer about science. I couldn't imagine doing one without the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And speaking of religion and science, we have here an annual Darwin Week at the College of Charleston.
I'm delighted to hear that. That's wonderful.
Well, there might be one concern you have, that it's organized by an evolutionary biologist who's also a committed Christian. And he and others believe that evolution and science are compatible, and that if people had to choose one or the other, especially here in the Bible Belt, most would wind up rejecting evolution. Do you think religion and science are compatible?
They're clearly compatible in the strict sense that there are many religious scientists. And Francis Collins is one name that's always mentioned, John Polkinghorne's another. When you meet a religious scientist, you ask exactly what do you believe. In the case of Francis Collins, in the case of John Polkinghorne, you'll get standard Christianity. In many cases, you won't get that. In many cases, what you'll get is a kind of Einsteinian pantheism. You'll get people who say, oh, I believe there's something mysterious in the universe. There's a deep mystery, and I feel almost mystical when I look up at the stars. And of course, we all do. If we've got any imagination, that's what we do. That's what Carl Sagan did. That's what Einstein did. Einstein was fond of using religious imagery. Einstein said, what I really want to know is, did he, meaning did God, have any choice in creating the universe? That didn't mean that Einstein believed in God. What it meant was that Einstein was a poetic way of saying, is there more than one way for a universe to be, or is there only one way? When Einstein said, but he does not play dice, again, he meaning God, does not play dice, he was expressing his skepticism of Heisenberg's indeterminacy principle. Right. Many times, scientists who sound religious are actually only religious in the Einsteinian sense. But still, there are plenty of them who are genuinely religious, who are devout Christians. No doubt your colleague is one of them. Any self-respecting bishop or archbishop or cardinal or indeed pope does believe in evolution. That comes as something of a surprise, I think, to some fundamentalist Christians. I personally do find an incompatibility, but that seems to be just me because there are, as I say, plenty of religious scientists.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if it's just that a lot of them were raised religious and feel that they need to keep in the religion of their birth because of their family, or whether they really believe. And I enjoy saying, okay, you believe in God, what's your God like? And just to see if it's some supernatural being watching over you, or is it some kind of deistic God that then created the universe and retired to deity emeritus?
Yeah. Or even less. or even less. I mean, a deist God who retired seems to me to be every bit as improbable, not quite, nearly as improbable as a theistic God. But I thought you were starting to say that many people who are observant members of a religious tradition, I mean, I'm not an observant Christian, but I consider myself a cultural Christian in the sense that I know a lot about the Bible, I go to church on Christmas and sing carols and things. I think this applies to Jews probably even more. Yeah. I mean, there's a sort of more of a loyalty to an ancient tradition, which many Jews who are atheists nevertheless respect and actually perform Jewish ceremonies. I don't think you do that, but you probably have atheist friends who do. Mm-hmm. I've hugely enjoyed your autobiography, which Shonn mentioned at the beginning. I think I wrote the foreword to it.
Yes, and I hugely enjoyed the foreword to my autobiography.
And I wanted to quote from right at the beginning. A rabbi delivered a moving sermon telling how we are nothing in this vast universe and that we must let God know we are appropriately humble. After the sermon, the assistant rabbi ran to the front of the congregation and yelled, "I am nothing." Next, the rabbi's wife ran up and shouted, "I am nothing." The president of the congregation did the same. Then a newcomer ran up, yelling, "I am nothing." At that, an old congregant poked the man sitting next to him and complained, "So look who thinks he's nothing." And Herb used this as an example for the difficulty which anybody faces when writing an autobiography. He says, although anyone who writes about himself must have a bit of an ego, mine isn't so big that I think everything about me is noteworthy. But I think at lunchtime today, Herb, you did add, but myself is the only thing that I'm the world authority on. Right. And you also wrote, writing your life story is more like being a suicide bomber. You only get to do it once. So after reading about my life, perhaps you'll be inspired to write about yours. Well, it's funny you should say that, because I have, in fact, just completed volume 1 of my autobiography. And
well, I'm glad that I inspired you.
Yes. It's too late to ask for your advice on how to write volume 1, because it's unfortunately just finished. But volume 2 hasn't even started yet. And so I would like to discuss with you the problems of how to write an autobiography, being humble, and yet at the same time acknowledging that because you've been persuaded by publishers to do it, presumably somebody's interested in reading it. I mean, how are we going to do it? Well, you've done it already. How do we do this?
Well, frankly, Richard, it's a lot easier for me to be humble than it is for you. Because, publishers didn't run begging me to write my autobiography. I wanted to do it in large part because, I had come out as an atheist, and I decided after that, let me just come out with my life. So I have essentially no secrets left, much to my wife Sharon's dismay. It's a sort of thing that I really wanted to write an honest account, and I have another advantage over you. Here I'm a Jewish atheist living in the Bible Belt, so that automatically gave me a lot of funny stories to write about.
Well, tell us some of them, because they're...
Well, a lot of them are in the book,
yeah.
But just running for governor, and the reason I ran for governor is because I found out here in South Carolina, atheists were not allowed to become governor. So, of course, that made me want to run. And it took, about 8 years, first as a candidate for governor, and the judge ruled that he would only rule on the emeritus if I won the election. Well, to the surprise of no one, I lost. But then I found out I was ineligible for any public office. And the only one that I had a chance of winning, not even dog catcher, would be notary public. So I applied for notary public, and eventually with the South Carolina Supreme Court acknowledged that, yes, we should follow the U.S. Constitution. So I was granted my notary public after 8 years. And that's a large part of my autobiography. But I also wrote about my family life. I grew up as an Orthodox Jew, where I thought like Reformed Jews were almost as bad as Gentiles. That's what we learned. And eventually starting to be logical, reaching the age of reason, I decided I'll keep the parts of my religion that make sense to me and discard those that don't. And it wasn't very long till God went also.
Yeah. Well, I love the bit when you were running for governor, to show the sincerity of your real motive. I think a reporter asked you, what would be your first act if you were to be elected? And I think you said, resign or
no, demand a recount.
Demand a recount. That's wonderful.
Or they even asked me, what would it take to make you believe in God? And I said, well, maybe if I won the election. It would take that kind of a miracle. But, aside from having their religious beliefs punctured, some people are skeptical about evolution because it, in their mind, takes too long to see any results. What do you think is the simplest evidence for evolution to convince the unscientifically minded?
Okay, well, on the point about it taking too long to get results, that, of course, is true. And that's inevitably true, and if you don't understand that, you can't even begin to understand. I mean, if you expect, as some people do, I'll believe in evolution when I see a monkey give birth to a human, that kind of thing. So you do have to appreciate that it does take a very, very long time, and you have to appreciate that there is a very, very long time available. And there are various analogies that have been developed to express this. And one of them that I like, it's not my own, so I can plug it, is to stretch your arm out and say the origin of life is where my bow tie would be if I had one as beautiful as yours. The origin of life is there, and the present is the tip of my longest finger. And then you ask, what have we got as we walk along my arm? Well, it's all bacteria out to about there. We're talking about 4 billion years. It's all bacteria out to about there. Dinosaurs come in about there. Humans come in, or hominid-like creatures, human-like creatures come in at about near the tip of my fingernail. And the whole of human history, the whole of recorded history, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, the ancient Greeks, the Hebrews, the Romans, the whole of human history falls as the dust from one stroke of the nail file. That's how insignificant historical time, human historical time, is compared to geological time. And it's geological time that we're dealing with when we talk about evolution. So that's one thing to get across, is the sheer magnitude of the time that's available. It doesn't actually need all that much time. Evolution is actually faster than it needs to be. There's more time than is required in order for it to work. But you ask me, what's the single most convincing evidence for it? Surprisingly, it's not fossils, I think. Fossils are very convincing, and contrary to creationist myths, there are lots and lots of them, and they do show a very beautiful evolutionary progression. Creationists often say, where are your intermediates? Well, of course, there are plenty of intermediates. There are some gaps. In the case of the turbellarian flatworms, there's one big gap because there aren't any fossils at all. This is a very large, diverse, beautiful, elegant group of animals which simply doesn't have any fossils. So either they were all born yesterday. Okay, you get the point. Not all animals do fossilize. But what is really telling is that there's not a single fossil in the wrong place. There are plenty of places where it would be nice to have a fossil, and there isn't one. But as J.B.S. Haldane said when asked what would disprove evolution, he said, fossil rabbits in the Precambrian. There aren't any, and there's nothing remotely like that. There are no fossils in the wrong place. But fossils, even so, convincing as that is, are not the most convincing evidence. I think the most convincing evidence is probably molecular, something that wasn't available to Darwin. Darwin was very convinced and convincing about comparative evidence. He looked at the comparative skeletons, for example, of mammals and showed that the human hand has all the same parts, down to extreme detail, as a bat's wing or a whale's flipper or a rat's paw or a horse's hoof with toes missing. Nowadays we can do that with molecules, and it's many orders of magnitude more convincing, because with DNA, or with the protein that is directly produced by DNA coding, you've got enormous quantities of digital literary text in every one of your cells and in every one of the cells of every living creature that's ever been looked at. And you can directly compare these literary texts exactly as a biblical scholar might compare different versions of the book of Isaiah or something like that. And you can look for changes, letter by letter changes, and show that there is overwhelming evidence that living things fall on a family tree, or at least a tree, and there's no other explanation for having a tree like that, of such detailed branching shape as a family tree. And you can do it for this molecule and that molecule and the other molecule, and you get essentially the same tree. To me, that is the most convincing evidence. Almost equally convincing is the evidence from geographical distribution. The distribution of animals and plants on the islands and continents of the world is exactly the way it should be if evolution has taken place, and exactly the way it should not be if they had all dispersed from a ship marooned on the top of Mount Ararat.
Speaking of which, there are people who say, well, I believe in microevolution, but not macroevolution, because humans are special, that God just created humans. And the way you describe it, I could see why a lot of people might reject evolution, because if we're special and the way we have bacteria and everything else over millions of years, if there were a God, humans would seem to be an afterthought.
Yes, I mean, I simply don't understand how anyone can think that all the rest of the animal kingdom has evolved, but we haven't. I mean, we are so incredibly similar to chimpanzees, and far more similar to chimpanzees than chimpanzees are to monkeys, for example. That simply doesn't make any sense. Macroevolution and microevolution, these are words that professional biologists do use, but they're particularly favorite words of creationists. Macroevolution is what you get when microevolution goes on for a very long time. It's as simple as that. That's all there is to it. It's a bit like the transition from baby to adult, you might say, is macro development. And it happens gradually. Nobody ever, or from adult to middle age to old, it's not something that suddenly happened. You don't go to bed middle-aged and wake up next morning and say, I seem to be old this morning. It all happens gradually. And that's the same thing with microevolution. It happens gradually. And when enough of it has happened over a sufficient number of millions of years, what you've got is a change big enough to be called macro. That's all there is to it.
Because I even wondered about this. Humans have souls, but other animals don't. But for those who accept evolution, what about the first human who came from non-humans? So, the soul problem seems to be quite problematic.
This is standard. This is now current Roman Catholic doctrine that yes, we are evolved. Yes, we are cousins of chimpanzees. But at some point, God stepped in with his divine hypodermic and injected the soul. So, as you say, that seems to suggest that there was a moment when a pair of hominids of some sort, maybe they were archaic Homo sapiens, maybe they were Homo erectus, and they looked down into their grass cradle somewhere on the African plains and said, we seem to have given birth to the first ensouled Homo sapiens.
And I think your wonderful book, and your latest one, The Magic of Reality, talks about why there couldn't have been a first human like that. And I think the book is very pro-science, but not necessarily anti-religion. You simply give different creation myths along with the biblical one, and then you follow it by verifiable scientific explanations for what really happened. Now, such an awesome scientific history is, to me, the greatest story ever told. And I'm wondering if you called the story magic, as in the magic of reality, because that was awesome kind of magic.
Yes. Well,
and what do you mean by magic?
yes, I mean, I think you could mean three different things by magic. One of them is magic spells, as in fairy tales, where princes turn into frogs, or is it frogs turn into princes, that kind of thing.
That's macroevolution.
Yes. Macro, yeah. And the next is stage magic, conjuring tricks, which can be so incredible that you're almost forced to believe they're supernatural, but then if the conjurer is honest, he'll tell you, no, it's not. It really is only a trick. There are some conjurers who are fakes and charlatans who actually make a good living pretending that what they have are what they call paranormal powers. There's one who I won't mention because he's the most litigious person on the planet. I once got a letter from his lawyer, because I had referred to a spoon-bending charlatan. And it seemed he recognized himself. We're getting ringing. Could we stop it? Thank you. Hello? Okay. So that's the second kind of magic. Oh, and by the way, this same spoon-bending charlatan has, I believe, been paid large sums by oil companies, if you please, to use his psychic powers to divine where to dig for oil. That's the second kind of magic. The third kind of magic is the magic of reality, the magic that you feel in your soul, even. When, as I said earlier, you look up at the stars, when you look up at the Milky Way, when you contemplate the expanding universe, when you look into a microscope, when you look into an electron microscope and see the astonishing complexity and elegance of living things, when you look at the Grand Canyon and you see the geological strata laid out before you. This is all magical. Reality is magical. And we've all been anesthetized by familiarity with reality because we experience reality every day since we were born. And so we forget how utterly astounding it is to be given the privilege of living in this universe. Mm-hmm. And science gives you the privilege of understanding it, the privilege of understanding why you're here, what it is, how big it is, how old it is, how did it start, how it's going to end, how did life start, what was the history of life. This is granted to you as a citizen of the 21st century. It was not granted to a citizen of the 17th century or the 18th century. It was about half granted to a citizen of the 19th century. And so it is an astonishing privilege, and it's magical to enjoy that privilege of living in reality and understanding it.
That was, to me, a very moving explanation, with one exception. And that was when you say, I felt deep in my soul. What I worry is that there are going to be people out there that says, even Richard Dawkins believes in souls.
Yeah. You have to watch your language.
Yeah, and that's what you were talking about, Albert Einstein and others who can misinterpret our terminology.
You're totally right, Herb, and I should have been more careful.
We knew what you meant here.
Not that there's anybody in here who would misunderstand that, but this is going to go out, it's being filmed, and it's going to go out. Let me tell you a cautionary tale about that. Can I?
Sure.
I was having a debate in Oxford with actually a mathematician. And I knew, because I'd had a previous debate with him, that he literally believes that Jesus was born of a virgin and literally believes that Jesus turned water into wine. And this astonished me because I was accustomed to the idea of being told, I mean, I'd been, as it were, bullied for going after easy targets, going after fundamentalist nut jobs, when what I should have been doing is going after sophisticated theologians. Here was a sophisticated theologian who believed that Jesus turned water into wine, and I was sort of staggered by this. Anyway, I met him a couple of years later in another debate in Oxford, and I wanted to make the point that here was a sophisticated theologian who believed these astonishingly naive things. Now, I used a technique which I've called the Eddington concession. Eddington was a famous astronomer who wanted to make the point that the second law of thermodynamics has something very, very special about it. There's something. The second law of thermodynamics is a scientific law like no other, was what the point he wanted to make. And he made it like this. He used a rhetorical trick. He said, your theory may disagree with Maxwell's equations. Well, so much the worse for Maxwell's equations. Your theory may disagree with observed facts. Well, so much the worse for the observed facts. These experimentalists do bungle things sometimes. But if your theory disagrees with the second law of thermodynamics, I can offer you no hope. There is nothing for it but to I think he said, dissolve in deepest humiliation. Now, you see what Eddington was doing. He wasn't for one moment saying that he disagreed with Maxwell's equations. He wasn't for one moment saying that experimental physicists really do bungle things all the time. He was using the rhetorical trick of going out of his way, bending over backwards to make concessions in order to emphasize that this really, really special point about the second law. And I call that the Eddington concession. I used the Eddington concession on this Oxford mathematician. I said to him, I could just about believe that there's a deistic God who created the universe and created the laws of physics and set it all going and set up conditions such that galaxies would form and stars would form and chemistry, elements would condense, chemistry would form, life would start, evolution and so on. I could just about believe in a deistic God. I don't actually believe in it, but that at least would be a respectable idea. We could have an argument about that. But my opponent on this platform believes that Jesus turned water into wine. Okay? You see what I was doing? I was using the Eddington concession in order to emphasize the absurdity of his believing that Jesus turned water into wine. And he muttered and fumbled and couldn't really handle it. 2 days later, he went up to Scotland and gave a speech. I wasn't there, but a colleague of mine was. She was sitting in the audience. She took notes, detailed notes. And what he said to that Scottish audience was, 2 days ago, I was in Oxford, and Dawkins agreed that there is a deistic God. Oh, no, he didn't quite say that. That's not quite fair. He said, Dawkins moved a long way to accepting that there is a deistic God. This is real progress. Now, that is dishonest. Yeah. That is flagrantly dishonest. He must have known that I was using, I didn't call it the Eddington concession, but he must have understood the rhetorical trick I was using. He clearly didn't really believe that I had made a concession. Mm-hmm. This was sheer dishonesty. This is what we call lying for Jesus. And you're right, Herb, to pull me up on, that was rather a long digression, but you're right to pull me up on having used the word soul. Because one is vulnerable to somebody wantonly and mendaciously saying that I believe in the soul in the sense of, say, something immortal that goes on after we're dead.
Mm-hmm. Right. You know, in terms of evolution, there are some people who don't necessarily attack the science of evolution, but its consequences, like it leads to social Darwinism, the survival of the fittest, and then, of course, the Holocaust. You know, what I really liked about your book is that The Magic of Reality is, to me, I got the opposite impression. For instance, one of the things I liked the best, and I think children would also especially appreciate it, is the picture you had of ancestors over different generations who barely resembled you, but eventually stopped resembling you. And then you went to your 185th million great-great-grandfather, and you turn the page, and it shows a picture of a fish. Yeah. Now, such a visual puts into perspective, I think, these fights that we have today about our differences on race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, when we think, you know, we all came from this fish.
Yeah. We all came from this fish, but we, all humans, are extremely close cousins. We are actually a very uniform species. It's hard to realize that because we see apparently great differences, and maybe that our senses are particularly geared to see great differences, or it may be that the differences are all superficial, things like skin color. But actually, if you look at it genetically, the human species is far more uniform than many other species, including chimpanzees. It's been said that 2 chimpanzees in the same forest are genetically more different from each other than any 2 human beings anywhere in the world. So humans are a very, very uniquely uniform species. We are very, very close cousins. It's a salutary political lesson to say how closely related we are. The accusation that Darwinism leads to social Darwinism leads to ultimately to Nazism is a vile calumny. It's frequently used. Even if it were true, it wouldn't make Darwinism false.
Right.
I mean, what's scientifically true is scientifically true, whether or not it has ever been used to inspire horrible political doctrines. Actually, if you search the pages of Mein Kampf, you will find not a single mention of Darwin, not a single mention of evolution, plenty of mentions of God and providence. So Hitler himself, although he's said to have been inspired by Darwin, doesn't seem to have been in any very obvious way. But even if he was, that would have absolutely no bearing whatever on whether Darwinian evolution is the correct explanation for life, which it is.
Right. And I do want to give thanks here to my great 185th great-grandfather, and just to not be sexist, also to my 185th great-grandmother, even though they weren't married. Now, Richard, you've said that raising children as religious fundamentalists is a form of child abuse.
Not quite. I said that telling children about hell is a form of child abuse. And I've said that labeling children, I think few people would dispute that telling children about hell is a form of child abuse. But labeling children is slightly harder to get. And you get it as soon as you imagine the thought experiment of labeling a child, what shall we say, a postmodernist child, a secular humanist child, a Marxist child, a liberal socialist child. You don't do that. Nobody talks about a Gramscian Marxist child. But plenty of people talk about a Catholic child, or a Muslim child, or a Protestant child. It seems to be that religion has got a free pass in our society, even among those of us who are not religious, a free pass to allow to call children by the religion of their parents, even 4-year-old children, 3-year-old children. I cited in support of this a charming photograph which was published in the Independent newspaper in London one Christmas. And it was trying to get the Christmas spirit. It was trying to evoke the spirit of ecumenicalism. And it had a picture of 3 little children, 3 little 4-year-old children, in a nativity play. And it gave their names, Shadbreet, a Muslim, somebody else a Sikh, somebody else a Christian. And they were playing the 3 wise men in the nativity play. A 4-year-old Sikh, a 4-year-old Muslim, and a 4-year-old Christian. What on earth are you doing? Labeling children Christian, Muslim, and Sikh, when these children haven't the faintest idea what that means. Would you ever call a child a Hayekian child or a Keynesian child? Of course you wouldn't. And as soon as you get that, as soon as you hear me say Keynesian child, you immediately realize that you're never ever going to let anybody get away with calling a child a Catholic child or a Jewish child or a Muslim child or a Protestant child again.
Now, Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg said, with or without religion, there will be good people doing good things and bad people doing bad things. But for good people to do bad things, that takes religion. Now, I wondered if you agreed with that, or do you think, as many do, that fear of a God keeps some morally challenged people from committing atrocities?
Well, Herb, I think it was you who said in your book somewhere that if you ask somebody, why are you good? And he says, I'm good because God... Well, if I didn't believe in God, I'd go out and rape and murder. Then you're going to edge away from him.
Well, what people have said to me, well, as an atheist, I suppose you feel free to go out and rape and murder and do whatever you think you can get away with. And I usually would respond, well, with an attitude like that, I hope you continue to believe in a God.
Yeah, that's right.
Because I really don't think they do. And in debates with fundamentalists, I've asked, like, how would you behave differently if you stopped believing in a God? And some of them have a lot of trouble explaining that. One fundamentalist minister said that, I've often been tempted by other women, but I didn't act on that because of my love for Jesus.
You say, because it would hurt Jesus.
Yeah, because I know it would hurt Jesus.
Yes.
So that gave me such an easy opening. I was tempted too, but I don't because of my love for my wife Sharon, because I know how it would hurt Sharon. And even the minister's wife seemed to like my answer better.
It is actually, it's an astonishing idea that the only reason you're good is that you're frightened of the great spy camera in the sky. I mean, what a terribly ignoble reason to be good. You're only good because you're frightened of being found out. Well, maybe people are, but that's a very cynical view of humanity.
And it's not what I would call morality either.
Certainly not morality, no. Or frightened of going to hell. The other reason people may give for being good if they're religious is that they think they get it from Scripture. And they often cite the Ten Commandments. And what happens when that happens is you have to ask them, do you actually know what the Ten Commandments say? And they don't. They only know one or possibly two. They don't know the first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me. They don't know the second commandment, what is it, thou shalt... what is it again? Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. Thou shalt keep the Sabbath holy, and so on and so on. Then they come to thou shalt not kill. Well, everybody knows thou shalt not kill. And I love Christopher Hitchens' response to that, which I actually like to think of in the voice of John Cleese. Moses comes down from the mountain bearing the tablets, and all the children of Israel gather around and look at it, and they say, thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not kill. Oh, how silly of me. You see, we thought that killing was a terrific idea. Oh, silly me. You don't need tablets of stone to say, thou shalt not kill. And you don't need tablets of stone to say, thou shalt keep the Sabbath holy, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, thou shalt have no other gods before me. These people want to stick the Ten Commandments up in courtrooms and schoolhouses, and they don't know what's on the Ten Commandments.
And thou shalt not covet your neighbor's wife or ox or any other of his property.
Shall I make my joke about that?
Of course.
Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife or her ass.
Switching over to a more dignified, just for a moment. Richard, I know that your The Out campaign is very serious and important to you. What advice would you give for people in places like South Carolina, and I've heard a lot of this, who just fear the hostile reactions from friends or in the workplace for coming out as an atheist?
Well, the Out campaign is in a way modeled on the gay campaign at coming out. It's not a campaign to make people come out, and nor should it be in the gay case either. I mean, we're not in the business of outing people, but to show that atheists are nice people, decent people, ordinary people, loving people, people such as you would meet all the time in any profession. To be an example is probably the best thing we can do. I know that it's very difficult for many people, especially in this country, to come out because they fear the reaction of their family, perhaps. I've heard numerous stories of young people in America who have completely lost their religious faith, and they call themselves atheists privately, but they don't want to come out and say so because they are afraid of upsetting their parents. In some cases, more than upsetting their parents, they actually get thrown out. This is an extraordinary reaction for what's merely a difference of opinion about the cosmos and the way society should be run and things like that. It's an astonishing violation of the normal parental love or grandparental or whatever it is. So it is difficult. But when people discover that ordinary, nice, pleasant, decent, law-abiding, tax-paying people are atheists, it must make a huge difference. Herb, I think you said sometime, somebody said to you, "You're the only atheist I've ever met," and you said,
no, I'm not. I'm the only open atheist.
Only one who says so, or something like that. Yeah.
Because for every person they know is an atheist, especially here, there are hundreds of people who just don't acknowledge being an atheist.
Yeah. Well, I've been enormously encouraged, especially in the so-called Bible Belt in America. We tend to concentrate my lecture tours in the Bible Belt. And what's enormously encouraging is that time after time in the book signing queue afterwards, when people are coming along to have the book signed, they will say, "Thank you, thank you, thank you. You've inspired me to come out. You've inspired me. I mean, I'm an atheist." They may say, "I don't dare say I'm an atheist, but I am." And so it's a real thing we can do to encourage people in, actually, frankly, in places like South Carolina, I suppose, to encourage people to stand up for their convictions. I'm also encouraged by the number of people in all walks of life, waiters in restaurants, taxi drivers, bus drivers, who astonish me by saying they've read my books and agree with them. And it's a very, very moving thing for me to have that experience. And they're not all academics.
Okay, Richard, you've heard the expression to be more Catholic than the Pope, meaning ultra-Catholic. Well, you inadvertently created a meme of being more atheist than Richard Dawkins. And that's because of something you said in The God Delusion, where you rate God belief on a 7-point scale, with 1 absolute certainty in God's existence and 7 absolute certainty in his non-existence. And you call yourself a 6. Many atheists, myself included, put ourselves closer to, say, 6.8 or 6.9. Why are you only a 6?
No,
Please explain yourself, okay. Richard.
I think I haven't invented. I mean, 6.9 is what you. I mean, I'm a 7 in the same sense as I would be a 7 about fairies and leprechauns. You cannot actually disprove leprechauns.
Okay.
But gods are the same. I mean, I'm an atheist about Yahweh in the same way as I'm an atheist about Baal and Mithras and Osiris and Jupiter and Apollo and Thor.
Okay, well, I think we have the same God beliefs then. I would love to continue this for a few hours, but it seems like other people would like to ask questions too. So why don't we open it up to the audience for questions? And don't look at me. Now we have the person who has the toughest job here, and that's John Huddleston from the Religious Studies Department.
Thank you. So yes, we're going to open up with some questions. Wow, a lot of people here. You think if the rapture happened this evening, would the room remain intact, or? So questions, please keep your questions short and to the point, so that we can get as many questions as possible. And we have people with microphones on this side also. Where's the other individual with the microphone?
Shonn,
okay,
here.
Yeah, so we'll start. Go ahead.
In regards to knowing his big boat, I never see you talking about population bottleneck in DNA as the evidence as it for it never has happened.
Well,
I never hear you talk about population bottleneck, or I have that back.
Well, you haven't listened very hard then. It looks very much as though humans went through a population bottleneck. What a population bottleneck is my microphone working? Yeah. What a population bottleneck is, well, it's sort of obvious really. The population of a species is reduced almost to extinction, to just maybe a few thousand individuals. And for some reason, it didn't quite go extinct, and then it expanded again. And you can get evidence for that from looking at the genetics of a modern population. It appears that the cheetah, that ultra-fast African cat, has been through a population bottleneck within the last few tens of thousands of years. But the cheetah gene pool is very, very restricted compared to other big cats. So they've been through a bottleneck, and we have too. I mentioned earlier that human genetic variation is very low compared to many other species, including chimpanzees. What I didn't mention is that the probable reason for that is that humans went through a bottleneck some 75,000 years ago, or thereabouts. I didn't quite understand what that had to do with Utnapishtim and his great boat, which he was encouraged to build by one of the gods when great rain was threatened. You'll be aware, of course, that the legend of Noah is inherited from the Sumerians, a much older legend.
Yes, right over here, yes.
I was wondering about that same population bottleneck. If, since we're more likely to feel altruistic to people who are related to us, like our siblings, if pack behavior is somehow correlated to a lack of genetic diversity in a species, so maybe that bottleneck would make humans more altruistic, and if we see that in other animals.
That's an ingenious suggestion, but it doesn't work because I don't know whether everybody is aware of the underlying theory that the questioner has in mind, which is the theory of kin selection. Natural selection favors altruism towards close kin, and the reason is that close kin are more likely to share the genes for altruism. Now, that has to be interpreted rather more subtly than that. Close kin has to be defined against a background of the general population. And so natural selection will favor altruism towards kin that are closer than the population at large. If the population at large happens to be very closely related because of a genetic bottleneck, then that is the genetic background against which relatedness is compared. And so you're still going to get extra altruism towards close relatives, towards brothers, sisters, nephews and nieces and so on. You're not going to get altruism towards everybody that you meet, simply because everybody that you meet is, by chimpanzee standards, a cousin. You have to consider, the theory explicitly takes account of the relative degree of relationship compared to the background population. And if the background population are all the equivalent of, say, fourth cousins, then that's the background against which true relatedness is measured. So ingenious, but as they say, no cigar.
Yes, right over here.
All right, well, let me stand up. I'm going to send a penny to you with Dr. Cornwell, is it? Have I mangled your name? It's an Indian head penny. It's of the style that was last made here in the United States that are godless. So my question is actually kind of to you. Are there any English currencies that are godless, or have you been cursed with the deity on your currencies forever and ever?
Well, I'm aware that that American dollar bills and other bills have "In God We Trust" written on them. I'm also aware that that's an astonishingly recent ancient tradition. It goes back, I think it goes back to 1950.
54, during
54.
the McCarthy era.
Yeah.
To protect us from godless communism.
Yes.
Well, since the faith-based initiative of 9/11, perhaps we should take it off our currency.
Yeah. But what's rather annoying is that many Americans think that it goes back to the founding fathers, which it doesn't.
Right.
You ask about English currency. I'm happy to say that the English, I suppose, £10 note has a very large portrait of Charles Darwin on it.
Wow.
As an educator, I find it hard to, in the age of testing, allow students to think critically and explore. How do you suggest that individual educators shape the generations of the future?
Do you want to answer?
Well, I think critical thinking is certainly essential in all areas. I know as a mathematician, I don't talk about God or atheism, but I do tell people, don't just rely on what a previous teacher said. Like, I'd often say things like, why can't you divide by 0? And they say, well, I learned that in high school. But what's the reason? Always go for the reason or for the evidence rather than let people just memorize stuff. And that's how I think educators should be teaching.
In Herb's book, he said, while mathematicians are less likely than the overall population to believe in deities, they are more likely to believe than scientists. A possible reason for this phenomenon might be that some theoretical branches of mathematics, including the one in which I do research, have nothing to do with the real world.
Yeah, and in fact, growing up in Orthodox Judaism, a lot of it made sense from a mathematical standpoint. You start with certain axioms, and you build from those axioms and have a logical framework. The reason you get nonsense out of it is because the axioms are bad. You can be logical, but start with bad assumptions. Yeah. So just keep in mind what's logical versus what there's evidence for as well.
As you said in your book, mathematicians, like theologians, are free to make assumptions and construct their own imaginary little worlds based on these assumptions. So
mathematicians understand that that's what we're doing.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, a question over here.
Over here?
Yes. Richard, this way.
Oh, right.
Behind.
In the beginning, you said that you were opposed to religious fundamentalism. And I think on your website you were talking about that was some of the things that you were combating. How would you define religious fundamentalism? And does that also include Islam and other Oriental religions as well, or is it specifically Christianity?
I think it would be a mistake to lump Islam in as an Oriental religion. Islam is an Abrahamic religion derived directly from Judaism, and therefore has to be lumped in with them, rather than with Oriental religions like Hinduism and Buddhism. Fundamentalism, it really comes back to the previous question of this young lady here. Fundamentalism is a religion that's based upon a holy book, on holy scripture, on holy tradition, rather than on a critical examination of the evidence. Whereas a critical thinker will say, I will examine the evidence and I'll change my mind if the evidence leads me to change my mind. A fundamentalist says, it's written in my holy book, and that's that. Nothing will ever change my mind. And they really do that. I was told by the professor of astronomy at Oxford of a colleague of his who is a professor of astronomy in an American university who writes learned papers in astronomy in astronomical journals, mathematical papers, and his mathematical papers all assume that the universe is 13.7 billion years old, but he privately believes it's 6,000 years old. So somehow he holds in his head a fundamentalist belief which is based upon Scripture, an utter misunderstanding of Scripture, but that's fundamentalism. You base your beliefs upon a book, upon a tradition, upon what a priest tells you. You do not base your beliefs on evidence and critical evaluation of evidence.
Hi, my name's Nicholas. I was wondering, what do you think about? I know that Charles Darwin and his wife had different views. When I think she was a Christian. From what I understood, I could be more specific. But what do you think about maybe like relationships now? People who have relationships and their partner does not believe as them, like an atheist to a Muslim or something like that. What are your thoughts on that?
You're right that Emma Darwin, Mrs. Darwin, was a devout Christian, and there is some evidence that she felt some grief at Charles's science and worried a bit that he might be not going to heaven where she was hoping to go. And Charles Darwin himself worried about upsetting her. This is one of the theories for why he delayed for such a long time after writing a really rather full account of his ideas, delayed some 15 years before he finally published them. And it could have been because he was afraid of upsetting his wife. I have heard, again, almost always from America, of stories of couples who've broken up because one couple lost his or her faith and the other one retained it. These are very, very sad stories. I've even been asked advice. What should I do? I love my girlfriend, but she can't tolerate the fact that I've become an atheist. And it's very hard to know what to advise. I'm inclined to say, talk some sense into her. It's not that easy. You have to catch the attention of the microphone.
Professor Dawkins, every time I teach evolution, I'm just amazed at how easy it is to boil it down to principles and how easy it is to understand, and I'm more amazed at how little it's understood in the general populace, and the objections never seem to have anything to do with the principles of evolution, and it seems that you have to deal with that on a regular basis, so I'd like to...
Yes, it isn't really that difficult to understand. We're not talking about quantum theory or relativity or even rocket science. This is something which is actually quite easy to understand. You have to get your mind around great spans of time, of course. And I more and more am realizing that the problem is quite simply ignorance. It's in a few cases that it's a fundamentalist unwillingness to even listen. But in many cases, there's a perfectly good willingness to listen, but it's just plain ignorance. I was rather moved some years ago. There was a young man who came to Oxford from an American Bible college, and he was a fundamentalist, young earth creationist. Not quite sure how he got in, but anyway, there he was. And he diligently came to my course of lectures, and at the end of the term's lectures, he came down to the front of the lecture hall and pounded the desk, and he said, "Gee, this evolution, it really makes sense." And I realized then that he had been a creationist, not because he had, out of conviction, he was a creationist because he just didn't know. Nobody told him. He went to a university where he wasn't taught it. And so I've been asking around, especially on this tour. I've just come from a week as a visiting professor at the University of Miami. and I met a number of educators, and they told me that in order to be a school teacher in this country, you need to have an advanced qualification in pedagogy. You're taught how to teach, but you don't have to have any qualification in the subject you're supposed to be teaching. So you have history teachers who know no history, biology teachers who know no biology, and in the case of evolution, because they know no biology, they're frightened of teaching the controversial aspects of it, because they're frightened of being bullied by bigoted parents, because they don't have the backup which they would have if instead of learning pedagogy, they'd learn biology, because then they would know how to handle it. I was told a very, very disturbing story in Miami. A biology teacher in one of the schools, in one of the high schools in Miami, began to teach evolution, as she should have done. One child objected on religious grounds and complained to her parents. The parents complained to the school. The head teacher of the school disciplined this teacher, made her apologize, and told her she was not allowed to teach evolution because one child of bigoted parents, ignorant parents, had complained. All the other children in the class therefore had their education suffer because of this one child. Fortunately, this teacher has had both courage and ingenuity, and she invited a professor from the University of Miami to come in as a guest teacher who was not an employee of the school and therefore not under the jurisdiction of the head teacher.
I just wanted to clarify, Richard, when you mentioned that evolution is controversial, you meant with religious people and politicians, not with biologists.
Oh, no, it's not controversial among biologists at all. I mean, details of it, of course, are, but the fact that we are cousins of chimpanzees and cousins of octopuses it's a fact, and it's not controversial.
There's a question from Frank.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Dawkins. I want to know, why do you think it's so hard for African Americans to let go of Jesus and Muhammad and other religions?
I don't have any personal knowledge, any personal insight, or much knowledge of American history. I am kind of aware that in the extraordinary conditions of suffering which the slaves went through during the time of slavery until the Civil War, religion was, in many respects, the only hope that they had, and I suspect that they were cynically manipulated by religious interests to try to keep them under control. As has been done so often throughout the centuries with people who are suffering under political oppression, religion is wheeled out as a tool of oppression. Don't complain, don't agitate, don't revolt in this life, just hang in there, and when you die, it'll all be all right. So it's possibly something to do with that, but it would be presumptuous of me, being white and not American, really, to say any more.
Well, I'll be half presumptuous, because I'm at least an American. I think there might have even been a positive side when African Americans could not speak out freely most places. One place they could speak out freely and organize civil rights marches was in churches. So that was a positive feature of church life.
And Martin Luther King would have been a good example
but then
of that.
A lot of the negativity and forced belief came along with that for some people, even though there was some good coming out of churches in the civil rights marches.
Our foundation, the Richard Dawkins Foundation, did organize a conference at Howard University as a deliberate attempt to speak out, to reach out to to an African American, an American university that's dominated by African Americans. And we got a very enthusiastic reception from those who came, but unfortunately, the numbers who came were a very small number compared to the number of people who are here tonight. And we suspected that there was organized opposition and that people were actually persuaded not to come. But I'm not sure how accurate that is. But of those who did come, it was a highly successful meeting. And we, at that meeting, we launched another T-shirt, not this one, another T-shirt whose slogan was, "We are all Africans," which of course we are.
I think it was the YouTuber. He said you could disprove the Bible in 3 words, basically. Snakes don't talk, is what his argument was. I was wondering, do you have a condensed version that you could give to people who maybe doubt evolution? An easy way of presenting it to them.
I don't think that many churchmen would accept snakes don't talk as a valid disproof, because respectable theologians don't take the book of Genesis literally anyway. I think you could probably come up with other... I mean, I think something like the New Testament doctrine of atonement, the New Testament doctrine of the divine scapegoat, that Jesus came and died for our sins, as though God, the creator of the universe, the divine mathematician, the celestial physicist, couldn't think of a better way of forgiving our sins than to have his son hideously tortured and murdered. That's not exactly three words, but it seems to me to be a pretty damning indictment of the central theology of Christianity. Now, as for a brief summary of evolution to convince people, Herb asked me that, and I tried to give it. I said the evidence from comparative molecular data and geographical distribution and fossils, and you can't put it into 3 words, but you can put it into a reasonably slim volume.
Yeah, do you know what I think a difficulty is in evolution, say, compared to astronomy, where astronomy can accurately predict that there will be an eclipse on, a solar eclipse on, I think, May 10th. And those who used to think that, oh, an eclipse, that's a sign of the gods being angry at us, no longer can think that way.
Yeah.
So evolution accurately describes the past, but not so much the future.
No, but you can't predict exactly what's going to happen in the future, but in a way you can say it's a prediction of what will happen if you dig in the ground at a certain point, at rocks of a certain age. If you dig in the ground and find a rock which is dated by radiometric dating to the Cambrian era, then the sorts of animals you will find are these animals and these animals and these animals. You will not find any mammals or reptiles, and if you do, the whole thing is instantly disproved.
Wittgenstein makes the claim that religious people, in expressing their belief, are not making direct epistemic claims, but rather expressing a certain way of life. He uses the example of the difference between saying, there's an airplane above me and I believe in the Last Judgment. So a religious person and the atheist are not playing the same kind of language games, because the religious belief is a way of life. So they're not exactly mutually comprehensible. What's your response to this line of thinking?
Did you
I
get
think
it?
he's saying that religious people think differently than evidence-based people. So is there any way to deal with that? I could be wrong, but that's what it sounded like to me.
Well, I think it's true. I think it's true that they think differently, and they shouldn't. I mean, how are you going to have an argument with somebody if you say, here is the evidence, and he says, I don't care about evidence, I just know what's true.
But I think a lot of them have different evidence, like Jesus came into my heart, that's my evidence.
Oh, yeah. Well, hallucinations, of course, are... I suppose the answer to that is that people think they're Napoleon. The asylums are full of people who think they're Napoleon, or indeed think they're God, which is another one. You cannot expect to convince somebody by saying, well, Jesus came into my heart and only I know about it. There are people who believe that
he'll come into your heart too if you just give yourself to him.
There are people who believe that some famous film star is in love with them, and they're in.
Yeah, I've only recently become aware of the University of Chicago doctoral program on the history of religion, and I'd love to see you collaborate with one of their professors there. I'll read you a short quote from one of his books. Throughout history, warriors must be convinced they are engaged in a sacred and rightful activity. It makes killing not only permissible, but an honorable act. The myth must be considered one of the most important narratives in world history. It is essential for all empires to link church and state.
I'm not aware of the University of Chicago. What was the key I missed the key phrase at the beginning of the...
Throughout history, warriors, our warriors are killing themselves right now. Obviously, we don't believe anymore that God is not on our side, perhaps.
Yeah.
And religion has got a sinister aspect that has gone on a long time. The school traces the evolution of the Indo-European language, and it's probably started in southern Russia. It's gone to parts of China, India, all the way to Ireland. Their God told them that all the cattle in the world were theirs.
Yes.
And anybody who had cattle nearby must have stolen them.
Yes.
And you say everybody should know not to kill. They did it as a sacred duty.
Well, of course, it is true that the injunction, thou shalt not kill, in any case, only meant thou shalt not kill members of thine own tribe. It didn't mean... And one of the things that we've progressed over in history is a generalization from thine own tribe to the whole of humanity, and maybe it'll progress to other species as well in the future. Recommend, by the way, Steven Pinker's great book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which he takes a long historical view of what he sees as the improvement in human ethics from early pre-human times up to the present day. But of course, you're right, and it is an aspect of fundamentalism that people will believe what they read in their holy book. And if their holy book tells them, this land is ours, given us by God, for example, then they won't listen to any alternative view that somebody else might have some claim to, whatever it is under dispute.
Even worse, God was in the real estate business, and he promised the same part of land to three different religions.
Yeah, religion may be a self-fulfilling prophecy about apocalypse in the Mideast.
Yeah. Apocalyptic prophecies which lead people to say, we don't need to conserve the world because Jesus is coming within the next 20 years, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question just as a young atheist. I've been very vocal and very sure and assured of my beliefs for what will feel like a very long time now. I went through my own series of understanding and believing and came out an atheist through research and real devotion to knowing what the truth was. It's hard for a lot of people to believe that simply because of my age, but once I did come to that belief, I make sure that it's known. I fight for my cause, I advocate for it, and the idea of spreading it is so much more important to me than simply believing it. So in that train of action, I've got a lot of negative speech, of course, and more often than not, I'm called an extremist or a militant atheist because I decide to stand up and voice my opinions. So how would you say to not only young or say maybe burgeoning atheists, but to atheists of all ages, how to fight being addressed or belittled in the way of being called militant or extreme simply because they voice their opinions?
Well, first, I applaud what you're doing, and I have great regard for what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
When people call you a... you could think about it like this. If somebody calls you militant or extreme, it may be because they haven't got any good arguments against you. And so that's all they've got is to call you militant and extreme. That would be one point. Another point would be that you can say relatively mild things against religion, and people will hear it as extreme because they're so unused to it. Our society has been lulled into treating religion with kid gloves. It's a very understandable strategy on the part of religion to make that happen. And the result of this is that if you use really quite soft and mild language, people literally hear it as militant and extreme. If you were to compare the mild language which most of us atheists use, with the sort of language that's used by theatre critics or restaurant critics or sports commentators, they may, and politicians indeed, they use far more extreme language. Or if you even listen to preachers who will denounce from the pulpit people like you and me and say we're destined for hellfire in the most extreme militant language, aggressive language, yet society is used to that, accepts it. That's what preachers do. So they're not called militant, they're not called extreme. Whereas if you say something quite mild, it sounds extreme to people. And I think you have to recognize that they're not necessarily being dishonest. Some of them perhaps are, but it's almost as though their ears have been distorted, and they literally hear it as extreme. Because if you say it mildly, because it's religion, it sounds extreme.
And I also think there's an evolutionary process that 50 years ago in South Carolina, you probably wouldn't hear any criticism of religion. And now that people are starting to criticize, that suddenly sounds militant. But the more people that do criticize and come out as atheists, it'll become accepted and it'll no longer be militant.
Yep.
Yes, Professor Dawkins. I'm here because I read a book called Why Does the World Exist by Jim Holt. And in that book, he talks about you a lot. First of all, have you read the book?
I haven't.
You haven't?
No.
Okay, because I'm here because he attributed a lot of views to you that intrigued me, and then I went and saw your TED Talks. And the question he posits is, why is there something rather than nothing? And he interviews a lot of physicists, cosmologists, philosophers, mathematicians. He doesn't interview you, but some of your colleagues at Oxford. And so I wonder, how would you answer that question of why is there something rather than
I think the first, it's obviously a very profound and difficult question. It's a question not for a biologist, but for a physicist. Let me recommend my colleague Lawrence Krauss, his book, I think his book is called Something from Nothing. And he is one of those physicists who thinks that that something sprang into existence from nothing, using quantum theory as the rationale for that. I obviously, as a biologist, not a physicist, cannot elucidate that for you. I recommend his book. What I can do is to say either Krauss and his colleagues are right and the universe sprang into existence from nothing, or they're almost right and the universe sprang into existence from something very simple. Now, something very simple is by definition easier to understand than something complicated. We now live in a world which is extremely complicated. Each one of us has inside our skulls what may be the most complicated thing in the universe. It probably isn't, but it's certainly very, very, very complicated. And this, we understand how we got to this level of complexity from a level of simplicity which was the level of chemistry. Not the level of nothing, but the level of chemistry. Darwinian evolution has shown us how we have got from the simplicity of chemistry, the comparative simplicity of chemistry, to the stupefying complexity of modern biology. Now that should be a cautionary tale. Don't ever say, because I don't understand something, therefore God did it. Now, wait, sorry, we haven't anything like finished, because I was asked about why is there something rather than nothing. Now, the point about biology is that it's a parable. Biology tells you that you can get from simplicity to complexity. Now, chemistry is not ultimate simplicity. The origin of the universe is either ultimate simplicity or something very close to it. And even if it's not literally nothing, it's got to be a hell of a lot simpler than any designer, creator, God could possibly be. And so to postulate a designer or creator as the answer to the riddle of why is there something rather than nothing is a simple evasion of intellectual responsibility. It doesn't answer anything. It erects a bigger problem than it solves. Not just a bigger problem than it solves, but a hugely bigger problem than it solves. It's just a non-starter, literally.
Yes. We have time for just a few more questions. Go ahead.
Hi. Do you think that humans would have created the social concepts of good and evil in the absence of religion? Or would you agree that religion was essential to the social evolution of humans?
I think that's one for you, Herb.
Oh, well, I tend to think that, I think it might be more for you in terms of evolution, because I think there might have been species that did go out and kill each other, that didn't have any kind of moral sense, and those genes died out, and we've eventually evolved to learn how better to live with each other, and then sometimes they might have put religious context to it to bring people into a line by saying maybe God told us to do it as opposed to it's just the right thing to do.
Yeah. I think this partly came up earlier when we were talking about religion doesn't provide any very moral reasons to be moral, and we had the thing about the great spy camera in the sky. The point you're making is slightly more subtle than that, which is that maybe historically we needed to go through a phase of being religious before the great moral philosophers. I mean, moral philosophy is a very respectable branch of philosophy which which at least doesn't have to involve religion, and the best moral philosophers are not religious. And so they come up with theories of morality which are often based on ancient and widespread principles like the Golden Rule and other such principles. I don't know whether historically religion was important in leading us to a state where proper moral philosophy could get going. But needless to say, even if religion was necessary for that to happen, that doesn't for 1 millisecond suggest that there's any truth in religion.
Hello, Professor Dawkins. I was wondering, at the end of The Selfish Gene, you brought up the notion of memes and mimetic transmission being part of our culture, another part of ourselves that isn't shared with our animals. When you were talking about kin selection, you were saying one of the limitations of that idea is that it can only really be applied to close family members, tribe members that have a similar genotype. I was wondering what you thought of the notion that perhaps those cognitive structures have been redirected towards our mimetic our memotype, if you will. And if that was a useful idea to think about how to spread our memes, Enlightenment memes, in competition with religious memes.
So you're suggesting a kind of memetic equivalent to kin selection?
Yes.
So a memetic kin, and your memetic kin presumably would be other individuals who share similar ideas, whether or not they share your genes. And they might be indeed religions. I mean, people who belong to the same religious sect are, you could call them memetic kin. I think it's an interesting way to think about it, and I shall do so.
The last question is from a geology student at the College of Charleston.
Hi, my name's Lindsay. This is completely off topic from what we've been discussing. I have an actual evolutionary biology question for you.
Is it your homework?
Yes, actually. It's. I'm trying to get you to help me with my homework. Have you, in your studies of evolutionary biology, come across any evidence that hybridization leads to advancements and progress in evolution?
Well, hybrid vigor is a well-known phenomenon, such that it's the kind of the opposite of the inbreeding depression which you get when close relatives mate with each other. So, I mean, inbreeding depression results from things like lethal recessives meeting their opposite number, and so that's why it's best not to mate with your brother or sister or your first cousin. And hybrid vigor has been suggested as being the sort of opposite of that. That there have been there's indeed some experimental evidence by Patrick Bateson that I think he worked on quail, that they prefer to mate with individuals who are not too closely related to them and not too distantly related to them. And his suggestion was that there was a certain amount of hybrid vigor which was favoured by natural selection. Agriculturalists, breeders of animals and plants know the phenomenon of hybrid vigor. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention we're in the largest auditorium on campus. We have standing room only as well as sitting room, and there are two other large rooms that are also completely filled. Now, three others. Now, Charleston old-timers might remember in 1998 when the College of Charleston beat the University of North Carolina in basketball, and our former College of Charleston president, Alex Sanders, called it the greatest day in the history of the college. I think most of us here tonight would say that having Richard Dawkins at the College of Charleston is even better. Thank you.
How do you guys, rationalize what happened in the biblical era?